Welcome to In All Honesty, the podcast where we get real about life and all the problems that come with it. I'm Michelle Elman, and I'm that friend who we all know is a little bit too honest. You might not come to me when you get back together with your ex, but I'll be there for you when it all goes tits up. Hello, and welcome back to In All Honesty. And this week we are talking about something quite deep, quite hurtful, quite painful at times. We are talking about the abandonment wound. This is something which a lot of you have asked me to go into more depth with, especially on my Q&As on Instagram on Monday that I do. I get a lot of questions about how the abandonment wound plays out into your romantic relationships. So what is the abandonment wound? If you have an abandonment wound, it usually means it's because either a primary caregiver was absent from your life, that can include death or loss, or someone was just not there for you emotionally in a way that you experienced neglect or lack of attention. And as a result, this feeds into your romantic relationships, but actually also your platonic relationships as well. It's largely how you orientate yourself around the people in your life. So let me give you a few examples. I have an abandonment wound. I learned about this probably a little bit more than a decade ago. And mine is largely formed around boarding school and hospital. So this is what I mean by the abandonment wound can be formed around something that's not logical and rational. So talking about hospital, logically and rationally, I knew my parents had to leave at 7 o'clock because of visiting hours. As a child, especially as a 1-year-old child, my brain does not understand that there are rules in place and the reason why they are leaving is because of visiting hours. What my body understands is I am in pain and I am looking for comfort and no one is here right now and I am alone. I am abandoned. And then that pain was emphasized throughout every single hospital experience. So that was largely when I was 1 year old, when I was 7 years old, when I was 11 years old, but then 19 is the cusp of adulthood. Re-experiencing that pain of, if I think about moments where I felt abandoned, I remember one of them was coming out of my brain tumor removal surgery. And at that time I wore glasses. And because the time at which I came out of the surgery was after visiting hours, my parents couldn't be there when I came out of a brain tumor removal surgery. This is honestly so stupid as I am speaking. Because can you imagine an 11-year-old child having a brain tumor removed and because it's the rules, her parents are not allowed to be there? Anyway, because of that, and also the fact that I couldn't wear glasses, I remember waking up from this brain tumor removal surgery, seeing a blurry figure at the end of my bedside, knowing that was the night nurse. And because I was in the emergency kids ICU, which meant you had one nurse to one person, she was the nurse looking after me. And I could see from my blurry, long distance, short-sighted, whatever it's called, eyesight that she was reading a book. But as a result, she wasn't paying attention, hadn't realized that I had woken up. And because I was straight out of a brain tumor removal surgery, I couldn't move. I couldn't reach my glasses, so I couldn't see. I couldn't move enough to notify her in some way that I was awake, and I had a tube down my throat so I couldn't speak or make any noise either. And so being in that hospital bed and knowing that, first of all, none of my comfort people are around, but then second of all, the one person whose responsibility is to look after me was not paying attention, that's how an abandonment wound can be formed. I also went to boarding school when I was 11 years old, and regardless of my parents' positive intentions, I truly believe that boarding schools are a form of neglect. I would never send my child to boarding school, and my parents couldn't have known that when they did it, and they were doing the best they could, and they genuinely sent me to boarding school thinking that was where I would get the best education. But having experienced the boarding school myself, I have a fundamental issue with the fact that your disciplinarians, i.e. your teachers, are also meant to be your primary caregivers. And therefore, you actually can't form that comfort relationship. Also, when you think about it, we lived in a house of 50 girls and we had 2 caregivers. When you have that many people that you are looking after, how are you creating a motherly bond with a person? You aren't. And therefore, the number of times within a boarding school, I remember I was crying myself to sleep, or going to the woods to cry rather than actually going to a parental figure, that emphasizes that feeling of abandonment. And how that plays out is if you learn that people are going to leave you, and this could be a sudden death of a parent at 10 years old, for example, you then tend to emphasize people-pleasing behaviors because the belief is that if you are good enough, other people won't leave. Other things that can happen is that you push people away because it's also easier to push them away than to have people leave you. If you never get close to someone, then they can't abandon you. And that's where I think a lot of these patterns that play out in romantic relationships, if you look back into your primary caregivers, you can actually recognize when your messaging got taught that way and when you learnt to behave around certain people. I think the thing with the abandonment wound is it's very deep and it is a very primal wound because when you have caregivers, your mother and father, that is the love that was meant to be automatic. And if that love wasn't automatic or you perceived it to not be automatic in some way, then that's when you start learning this relationship with love of that you have to earn that love or you have to be a certain type of person in order to get that love. So if you had to perform being compliant, if you had to perform being a good girl, if you had to perform being easygoing, low maintenance, all of these things, then why do you think you do that in a romantic relationship? Because that's what you got taught. You had to be a very specific kind of person in order to be able to gain the approval of people whose approval should have been automatic. The other way it can play out in your romantic relationships is it can lead to difficulty trusting people, difficulty trusting they're going to stick around, difficulty trusting that they actually like you, difficulty trusting that someone says what they means and means what they say. So, for example, if you had a parent who worked a lot, was always absent on business trips, and would say they would come to your year 3 assembly and then never actually attended, or if your favorite thing in the world was to go rollerblading and they never came to watch you rollerblade. Having those moments in your childhood therefore means that when someone says they love you, when they say they're going to show up, that's when this like almost testing behavior can start happening. And what you actually need to do is you need to go back into the moment in your childhood when you felt similar. So if you ever have a moment in your romantic relationships where you feel like you are overreacting, there is a saying that is controversial because of the word hysterical, but if it's historical, it's hysterical. And so you have to go back and ask yourself, let's say there is a moment in your life where you are really upset because your partner had to cancel last minute on a date. In that rejection, that abandonment wound will flare up. And what you need to do to heal that abandonment wound is go back and ask yourself, what does this memory remind me of? The age at which you were, go back to that age and now be the parent for that child and talk to that child within you and give her all the things that you needed to hear in that moment. So you are basically reparenting your younger self and providing the care and comfort that should have made her feel safe at the time to know that they will return. So if we look into the psychology behind it, there's a lot of conversation around attachment styles, and I hate that stuff because it's so much labeling and we demonize people with avoidance styles. But if you look at the research that actually stemmed from that, a secure person, a secure baby, so they roughly did the research around 3 years old, 4 years old. A 3 year old, 4 year old secure baby will play comfortably when the parent is present, will be upset when the parent leaves, but then can self soothe. And so, this is where if you are anxious, the anxious baby, even when the parent is in the room, will not leave that parent. And an avoidant baby will not notice whether the parent comes and goes. So, in order to get back to that secure place, what likely happens when you have an abandonment wound is you veer more on the anxious side. You can actually veer to both, but talking about the anxious side first, what happens is you think if you cling on harder and faster, then they can't leave you. Which is also why, if you felt that you get attached too quickly when you start dating, it's because of the abandonment wound for some people. It can be a number of reasons, but one of the things that happens when you have an abandonment wound is this idea that if you overshare, if you cling on harder, then it's going to protect yourself from if they leave. And ultimately, this is where we have to learn. If someone is going to leave you, they will. You cannot do anything to change that behavior or protect yourself from it. And if someone says they are interested and someone is interested in you, you have to believe it. If their behavior aligns with that too. Like if they're just speaking shit and not actually following up, then absolutely don't believe it. But then you also have to question whether the reason why you aren't believing them is because you have a habit and a pattern of having a childhood where people said they were going to turn up and they didn't actually show up for you. Another thing that happens when you have an abandonment wound is you tend to diminish or overlook your needs, because if you were to vocalize your needs and ask for them to be met, what would happen is you would put yourself in a position where a conflict could occur. And if you have a fight with someone, the abandoned wound will flare up because it will be that fear that if you have a fight, it means that you're over. And I remember one of the first fights I had in my first long-term relationship. I thought a fight meant game over. And so I had a very large reaction to us having a fight. And it took us a couple of minutes, probably a little bit longer, to figure out that, oh, I just thought a fight meant we were over. And they were like, no, that's actually just being in a relationship. Like, we can have disagreements. I'm not going anywhere. That sounds like such a small statement, but someone saying to you when you're in the middle of a fight, I'm not going anywhere, we're just having a fight, was the piece that healed the abandonment wound in me. And as a result, you can become quite conflict avoidant because in your head, fights are associated with someone leaving. And all you will want to do when you have a wound around something like abandonment wound is the worst case scenario is someone leaving you. And so you wouldn't put yourself in the position to do that. And so as a result, you can avoid issues. And that's how the explosions happen, because you are like pushing them down. And just if you push a balloon underwater, it's got to pop back up. And the harder you push down, the more viciously it will pop back up. I'm going to pause there and we're going to listen to the message of the week. So let's have a listen.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you very much for your podcast. It's such a great way to get all your fantastic knowledge straight into my life, into my room, into my house. My question today is about a friend who places more importance on our friendship than I do. That she has different kind of value and ways of going about life, which makes me think or realize that we are not going to be long-term close friends. We just don't relate in certain ways. And this is due to our different backgrounds, different upbringings, different life experiences. I've completely come to terms with this. And I'm fine with having kind of a surface level friendship with her. I don't give too much to her because I know I'm not going to get the same back in a way that will make me feel okay about that. But she thinks that we are much closer than I think we are. So my question is how to handle this. My instinct is not to tell her explicitly, despite the fact that I'm usually all for open communication and honesty, but just to allow her to realise this in the way that our friendship progresses over the next few months now that she has moved out. What would you suggest? Thank you.
This is so interesting because I often hear the message from the other side of it. I hear the person being like, my friend is pulling away. I don't know why. I'm really confused. What is the reason behind it? And how can I figure this out? And how can I open this conversation? So being the person who is actively pulling away, I agree with you. Sometimes you are more important to one person than they are to you. I don't want to know. That's how I personally deal with it. And the reason why I say that is I talk about it in Bad Friend about how bridesmaids, hen parties, weddings tend to reveal that. And I don't want to know if I rank lower in your life than you rank in mine. And this could be because of closeness, but it could also be because of the number of friends you have. I have a very small inner circle. So if you are in that inner circle, you are up there quite high. Whereas if you're the kind of person who has 25 friends, I get it if I'm just 1 out of 25. I think, though, if you pull away and someone doesn't notice, then it's mutual. Then that is all good. Then don't have the conversation, and the way you are going about it is great. However, if you know that you are more important to them, then it deserves a conversation. And it doesn't have to be a friendship ending conversation. It can just be a conversation around expectations, because that's largely what you're actually talking about. Although you didn't say the word, the thing that is coming up is that she expects more of you because you are more important to her than she is to you. And you can't meet those expectations. So having a conversation about that of, hey, I've just noticed that you rely on me a lot and like, I just don't think I'm in the headspace or have the space in my life right now. Like, you're still really important to me. I would love us to still be friends. I just find that sometimes The expectations you have are things that I cannot meet, and I don't want to keep letting you down. Phrasing it like that really puts the ball in her court, making sure you're on the same page. And ultimately, as much as it sounds like a negative conversation, you are reassuring her that you do actually still want her in your life, just to a lesser extent. I have had this conversation with a friend. It wasn't necessarily me saying I want more space forever, but it was me saying, hey, we've been bickering a lot. And as a result, I don't think this is great for either of us. I don't think it's bringing happiness to either of our lives. And so, right now, I think it would be best if we create more space between us. And hopefully, there will be a point in our life when we can be as close as we are now. But right now, being this close means us bickering all the time. And I don't want that for you. And I don't want to tear each other down the way that we've been doing. And so we need to figure out a way of doing something differently. And then it's a mutual conversation, right? Because it sounds like this is a person who's been in your life for a while. And I don't know whether you phrased it as like you're pulling away as a middle ground, that actually the reality is this is someone you don't want to be friends with at all, but you'd rather just have a periphery friend. And ultimately, the thing that like you just have to address is that the other person might not agree to that. The other person might not want you as a more distant friend. The other person might have a boundary or an idea around friendship where it's best friend or nothing. And I've also had that response. So I've had moments in my life where I've asked for more space and the person has said, if we take space, it's over. And she made that decision and she chose it to be over. I didn't want it to be over. I just wanted a little bit more space. I wanted us to have enough space where we could put our boundaries back in because it felt like the boundaries had fallen apart. And this is where, by having the conversation, it almost becomes a negotiation of a friendship that can work for both of you. Whereas right now you are making the decision for her, and that is fine because you are allowed your boundaries and you are allowed to make decisions about who you want in your own life. But keeping your friend informed, I believe, is out of respect for the friendship you once had, not necessarily the friendship you have now. And therefore, having that conversation is important if it means that the other person is being left in confusion. As I said, if the distancing is mutual, then it's okay to not have a conversation about it. But if you notice that they're still reaching out as often as they previously were, and you're just either not replying or replying a little bit slower and just hoping they get the message, well, they're not going to get the message because you've not sent it. And I think this is where direct communication comes in. Look, it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a hard conversation to have. It's difficult. They can be upset. They can get angry. There are so many responses that could come out of this, but at least you can know that you have communicated. And so you can expect that communication in the other friendships you have. You can't expect other people to communicate with you when you haven't communicated with them. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of the behavior that you are now doing, you will know it doesn't feel very nice. And that's why I advocate for more communication. I hope that helps. And it's such a lovely thought to hear that like I am in your home and in your ears and all of these things. And honestly, that's why I love having a podcast. So let's get back to the abandonment wound. So the abandonment wound will also likely flare up during the attachment process when you are in a romantic relationship. And what I mean by that is you can be dating someone casually, or you can even be dating someone in the early stages before you're exclusive, until there's a tipping point when that person becomes your friend, your family, your partner, you are attaching to them in a way that they're a little bit more inbuilt in your life. And for me, that process was always very difficult because by attaching to someone, you are putting them in the same circle of your primary caregivers, your family, your friends, people who matter to you. And if someone matters to you, that means they can abandon you. So what happened once I didn't really realize I had attached in one of my relationships until when he started going on business trips, I would start hysterically crying. This is something I actually have never spoken about because I had a lot of shame around it at the time. But anytime my partner would leave for a couple of dates, I would cry. And I didn't know why. And what explained it was the fact that even though my brain knows that my partner is coming back, my body didn't. And what was flaring up was the abandonment wound. And it took nearly a year and a half for my body to realize that every time my partner leaves, he will come back, almost like that baby in those research studies that I was talking about, of a baby has to learn when they get dropped off at nursery, the parent will come back. If you didn't learn that as a child, to learn it as an adult, often it comes with when you move in with a partner. and that partner leaves your home, your safe space, and actually knowing that in your body that partner is coming back and that you are not being left and you are not being abandoned. Now, the kind of crying that would happen when my partner would leave would scare him because it would be like hysterical crying and I really couldn't control it. And I even got scared at times. And I remember going to my life coach and being like, why am I crying? It's ridiculous. Like, he's only going for 3 days and it literally feels like my heart's being ripped out of my chest. But also, it feels like so big that it can't be about this situation. And as I said, if it's hysterical, it's historical. And so that's where it took my body a while to realize, oh, this is literally a childhood wounding that is processing itself. And this is where a romantic relationship can also be hugely healing, because the fact that I then had an opportunity in adulthood to relive it, but in a safe way, that I could have that experience of someone leaving and coming back. Every time that person came back, it healed that part of me. And eventually, one day, he could go on business trips without me crying. And we both just had to have this thing of, I remember there was a moment where I was like, just leave, just leave. And he was like, I don't want to leave you crying though. And I was like, honestly, if you don't leave me crying, you're not going to leave. And the funny thing is, the moment he left, I would be fine. But it was just that breakaway. I used to joke when I was younger of I'm really bad at goodbyes. In fact, I'm still a person who does Irish goodbyes a lot. And I think that's where this abandonment wound stems from, is that when I say goodbye, it is triggering that wound. And so it's easier for me to not say goodbye. And as much as there's a lot going on logically and rationally, it's very different what your body is experiencing. It's very different when a wound that is stemming from your childhood is being triggered, because you can't dump logic and rationale on it in order to problem solve it. You actually just have to go into your body and feel it. And if you want to do that, there is an episode on the podcast called How to Feel Your Feelings that will take you deep into how to actually experience that. But that's where the healing begins. If you aren't able to recognize this, what you are likely to do is try to then start pushing people away. Because as I said, I was scared by it. My partner was scared by it. Like, why are you hysterically crying every time I'm leaving for 2 days? And so what's easier, and if you are not self-aware about your behavior, you start pushing them away. You start testing them. You start finding ways to create problems or start fights, because the issue with intimacy is if intimacy is scary to you, you will then create intensity. And this is where people start fights over nothing, because it's easier to have an argument than to say you miss them. It also happens on holiday. So if you find that you are always fighting on the last day of the holiday, that's because the distancing that happens when you break away from each other after a really romantic holiday together is too painful that you start a fight, because it's easier to separate if a fight is going on. This is something which you really have to pay attention to, because actually starting fights at the end of holidays is something that people with abandonment wounds do all the time. The thing that really resolves a lot of this is the self-soothing that should have occurred when you were younger. So even just like rubbing your hands on your arms, like you're giving yourself a hug, or telling yourself that you're safe, that they're coming back, reassuring them, reassuring yourself that you are never going to abandon yourself, because abandoning yourself, and that can look like being someone else in a room of other people, changing who you are depending on the company you keep, and therefore not being authentic to yourself. That is abandoning yourself. And by doing that, you are triggering your own abandonment wound again. And so being able to self-soothe yourself, reassure yourself that you're safe, reassure yourself you are now an adult and that you are okay, and you don't need those caregivers in your life to depend on for food or comfort, because you are capable as an adult to comfort yourself. Those are really pivotal things to start moving towards healing your abandonment wound and ultimately creating safety, because creating safety is how it's going to heal. And whether that's safety around the people that you're with, safety in the home that you are building, all of these things are ways, or even very practical safety, like when you are healing, doing any inner child work, actually getting comfortable, getting a towel around you, getting a blanket around you, actually feeling warm, snuggly, safe while you are re-experiencing the past memories that caused the abandonment wound, and realizing that you aren't in that moment anymore and that you're not living in it. That's how the healing begins. So I hope that helped. It's something that's not actually spoken about as much as all the other clickbaity TikTok stuff that gets really spread around with a lot of misinformation. And this is why when I talk about these things, I really want to stop talking about them from like a psychology standpoint, the research standpoint, but also so that you have the information. Because like when you use these terms, I do think has to come with education. And so that's what I'm really passionate about. But if you follow me, you know that this whole podcast is all about squashing that misinformation, actually giving you the tools on how to heal it. We're not just talking about it. We're not just labeling ourselves with things. We are using those labels to understand ourselves better in order to make changes in our life. And so that's where life coaching is much more future centered. As always, we end every episode talking about something I am working on. And the thing I am working on right now is, I think I might have mentioned this in a previous episode, but I am still on a dating detox. And part of that is recognizing that I think I had let some of the messages around body clock get into my head. Because the other day I found some interesting words leaving my mouth. And I said to someone, if I was 27, there is no way I would want a relationship right now. But at 31, it's a very different conversation. And I realized that it shouldn't be. And if I was 27 right now, I would be single for the next year. Then shooting myself into wanting a relationship sooner than I actually do want one is not going to make it happen. The reality is right now I want to be single. And I don't think I had the headspace to say that with my full chest until about a week ago. And so what I've done is I've basically put dating, relationships, all of that on the shelf until my birthday, which is in August. And it's just not a priority to me right now. Frankly, men are a little bit uninteresting to me right now. And I'm leaning into that and being authentic to how I actually feel about it, rather than shaming myself for not feeling ready enough or soon enough to want a relationship. Obviously, I was quite quickly ready to date, but dating, or the way I was dating, is very different to wanting a relationship. And actually, the reality of being in a relationship, the thing that we never really speak about is how much time and energy it takes to be in a relationship. And even recalling moments in my life where I didn't have a single weekend for 3 months last year at the beginning of the year to myself, I'm really loving my time to myself right now. So I'm being authentic. I'm putting dating on the shelf. I am putting my love life in effect on the shelf until my birthday. And it feels good. It feels good to not have to worry about it or think about it or putting energy into things that were no longer satisfying me anymore. So that's what I'll leave you with this week.